Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Tyler Childers called Country Squire. You know, I keep looking back on the last couple of years of Patreon scheduling, 2017, 2018, with some degree of exasperation. Nothing against you guys. A huge part of the problem was me taking on way too much without a clear way of focusing or managing it. But it also meant that I just missed covering some acts you think would have been on my radar. And when you build a reputation on this platform for covering a lot of indie country, and yet for some reason you don't cover an act who's building a ton of hype and groundswell, well, I'm not sure how many of you cared, but I certainly felt exasperated about it. Such was the case with Purgatory, the long-awaited sophomore album from Kentucky native Tyler Childers. It was released in 2017, and it caught the indie country scene by storm, mostly thanks to a defiantly country palette full of ragged fiddle, and a notable production credit from Sturgill Simpson. It was loose, it was raw, it was sleazy, but in the right way, rife with flavor that just felt a step away from greatness for me, thanks to feeling a little underwritten and kind of meandering at spots. Good thematic cohesion, and it did grow on me with a lot of repeated listens, but it probably would not have made my year-end list in 2017, but also that Tyler Childers is definitely someone worth keeping an eye on. And his buzz caught fire in a big way, nabbing him a major label deal on RCA, but with the condition he would maintain some artistic freedom, which to me was a very positive sign. All the more evidence that any courting of Nashville radio is something that the indie scene just doesn't care about, and that the label means that they don't need to care about it in the same way anymore. Hell, that album cover, that should make that plain enough. So, alright, let's make up for some lost time here. What did Tyler Childers deliver on Country Squire? Well, you know, these are the reviews where I always feel like I'm a half step away from the indie country scene at large, because I absolutely do like this Tyler Childers album, but it's hard to avoid the thinking that Country Squire is punching a little lower than Purgatory, or indeed the subset of indie country that truly works for me. And that's kind of exasperating for me to call out, because in terms of tones and textures, I'd argue he's hitting the majority of the right buttons. But slide even a little bit deeper, and we've got a project that just feels a little undercooked, a little scattered. Still very much enjoyable, and I absolutely see why it's winning a lot of people over, but where repeated listens really drag me into the fold for Purgatory, it's not really happening here. It is good, but not quite great, and I'll admit a little bit of a disappointment. But before I get into what doesn't quite click for me, I want to highlight the stuff that does, mostly coming in the production and especially the instrumentation, which has got that bone-deep organic richness of tone courtesy of Sturgill Simpson's production that makes you wish that he would go more in that direction for his next album. And that warm melodic fullness makes a lot of these songs really hard for me to dislike. The bass and percussion provides a supple foundation and enough rollick to support the pluckier guitar pickups. The electric guitar tones are allowed to linger and smolder where they need to. The keyboards span from wells of organ to something closer to a saloon piano. And of course, that phenomenal fiddle pickup that galvanizes so many of these hooks. It sounds so rich, so great. For a project this short, Tyler Childers need to make as many of these songs as distinctive as possible. And while I'm not quite sure we get anything as far out of his comfort zone as Universal Sound, or really quite as a standout in that lane, there are plenty of little flourishes I really appreciated. From the squonking touches of country funk beneath Bus Route, complete with some very recognizable deeper backing vocals creeping at the end of each verse, to how that lead acoustic line keeps its subtle stomp driving through Housefire. Yeah, it's a little bit more conventional, maybe playing to the Americana set, but it's a great single. To even how the fiddles slice through Ever Lovin' Hand before we get the electric guitar sidling in for the jaunty solo, that definitely shows some of that bluegrass twinge that keeps things moving. And when you factor in a pretty solid flow from song to song as the guitars bleed into each other with some deeper traces of atmosphere, it really becomes hard for me to pinpoint any sort of issue given how seamless this album feels. But in a sense, that also might be where I might step away from the average indie country fan, because where Tyler Childers uses some of these elements in transition, I'd love to hear more mixed depth and experimental flourishes on the songs themselves. Sure, you get moments like the more sedate and smoky intro of Matthew, or the keyboard-saturated southern soul of All Urine, but if you're familiar with the timbres on a certain set of indie country and Tyler Childers' more traditional compositions here, can't help but feel a little bit more safe, a little bit more predictable. Maybe I would have been won over a little more if a couple of these songs expanded their runtime. This album goes down real fast. And considering how Tyler Childers' haggard, hangdog delivery doesn't really vary a lot, certain moments can feel a little bit uniform from song to song, a bit samey, although the occasional bit of slightly muddy vocal mixing doesn't really help his dynamics there either and help him stand out. And unfortunately, a significant part of this also circles back to the writing. Now, credit where it's due, Purgatory did manage to set a more consistent scene and muster more thematic cohesion the more listens I gave it, enough that when a couple songs felt underwritten or maybe a shade two-dimensional, I was willing to accept them given they contributed to the larger whole. Now, Country Squire, meanwhile, it feels more diffuse in terms of its themes and its writing, and overall seems to be taking a slightly lighter tone to the backwoods setting that saturates some of the project, lessens some of the tension and danger, and by necessity that kind of lessens some of the impact. There are some consistent moods that run across the majority of the album: longing and waiting for expectations to be fulfilled, somewhat desperation, the risk that comes when they might be, but still often better than the stasis of having them just neglected altogether or abandoned, which makes sense when you got the sort of scruffy love songs like the title track or All Your, or even to some extent Gemini, where our protagonist struggles with overthought boredom while working on the railroad and then consoles his girl to realize that while he might wander wherever he's gonna go to chase that dollar, there's still a part of him that's still very much there for her. Hell, Housefire is a great example of him trying to get her to cut a little bit more loose, set it all on fire, burn away the frozen weather, set the light that'll pull him home. And thus it kind of makes a crude sort of sense that Ever Lovin' Hand immediately follows as one of the more explicit masturbation songs I've seen in country or, well, music in general in a long time. And honestly, it really works. I like that song. But those longing moments of thought, they also come through in the reflections on Bus Route, a traditional snapshot of teenage fling built off a routine that's got some of that swampy vibe, and especially on Peace of Mind, where he references an old friend on the railroads where it's his scattered family that's keeping him together and sane, but you can tell those family ties even seem tenuous, and you can tell he's on the cusp of just cutting loose by getting high and letting it all burn away, trying to cope with that stress however possible. But the consequences of cutting loose, they're also in view. Creaker shows the guy who's chasing his dream by heading into the city, only to find himself utterly alienated and miserable, which can't quite capture the pathos of Jason Isbell's Last of My Kind, but is working in the same territory, and mostly works. But that also highlights two issues I do have with Country Squire. The first being that I keep expecting a real revelatory moment or punchline in these songs that doesn't quite materialize. Like, for example, this is an issue on the closing song Matthew, a good character portrait of a veteran returning home and finding some peace of mind in the outback, but it's also missing that moment to really drive it home, and the song kind of feels a bit abortive in its conclusion. And it's a similar feeling I get for the album as a whole. The emotional consistency is there. I appreciate Tyler Childers showing some diversity in the subject matter and making these longing pictures make sense together, but when I look for that added bit of pathos to yank it all together, make it more than the sum of its parts, it just doesn't quite come in the same way. Now, granted, some of this might just be me, again, differentiating myself from the average indie country fan for which the textural connections and the subtext, they're plenty enough. There might be more emotive significance for which I'm just not getting. But again, this feels more scattered and oddly safer than Purgatory was, and while the tones and descriptive writing highlight a lot of quality, I'm not quite sure that I'm all the way there for it. As such, for me, it's getting an extremely strong 7 out of 10, absolute recommendation, but keep in mind if you got more of an ear for the tones I've described, you'll probably appreciate this way more than I do. This is getting a ton of critical acclaim, and while it doesn't quite click for me, I see why. Otherwise, look, I'm not going to call Tyler Childers the next savior of indie country or the next heir to Sturgill Simpson's sound. Hell, Sturgill's still putting out albums. But there is promise here, so you know what? Check it out. I'm just hoping to hear more soon. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I'm a little bit on the fence with this. I know a lot of people are way more high on it than I am, and hey, the poll's right over there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. So are the comments. But if you want to buy or stream the album, links are also in the description down there below. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you're looking for the episode of Billboard Breakdown that came out yesterday, it is on the second channel. Links over here as well. If you also want to see videos from this current channel that might be more to your fitting, right over here as well. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.